Welcome to our coronavirus industry update. Thank you all for joining us on short notice. We think that it's really important to get the up-to-date knowledge, of course, and we want to make sure that our industry partners have that in their back pocket. We want to take a quick moment to thank all of our members today. We couldn't obviously do this work without all of you, so thank you to our coalition members, and we'll get things started here. So these are two familiar faces that you've seen before. Charles Cooper, our managing director at the Signal Group, and Noah Banian is our federal affairs manager here at People for Bikes. And they're both here to tell you a little bit about the lay of the land on the federal level on how our government is responding to this new novel coronavirus. So with that, I will hand things off to Noah. Noah, are you there with us?
Noah may have been temporarily disconnected. I can jump in and just give a overview of what our agenda is. This is Charles.
Oh, hi.
Oh, go ahead, Noah. Sorry.
No.
Hi, sorry about that. Thank you all for your patience. Thanks, Eric and Charles. And I hope you can all hear me all right. So today on our webinar, we are going to give a brief overview of the spread of coronavirus. Obviously, we can all turn on the news and see that information as well, but we want to make sure that you're also getting the best information on what's happening on the ground in Washington, D.C., how is federal policy making and a new focus in Washington and Congress going to have consequences and impacts to your business and the economy. We'll do a quick roundup of what they're talking about in the press, and again, just trying to help make that connection between a new focus in Washington, a new focus for federal funding and priorities, and what that means for not just the bike industry, but businesses across the US. And we'll go over some helpful resources online and places to make sure you're checking into. And from that, I'll give it over to Charles.
Thanks so much, Noah. I thought maybe I could start with a really brief timeline before we go into some of the dynamics of the current situation, and then come back to talk about what Congress and the White House are currently working on, which is the focus of our presentation today. I do want to remind everybody that this is moving very quickly, very fast, both in terms of new news, but also in terms of what the policy response is. So by the time we're done with this webinar, there very well may be some new adjustments that will be made aware of. So I would encourage you to keep updated through the resources that Noah will give at the end, and also we'll make sure to try to keep everybody updated on a fairly regular basis on our blog and other social channels when things of relevance to the industry pop up. Quickly on the timeline, just before the end of the year, 2019, the WHO was alerted that there were several flu-like cases in Wuhan, China. Fast forward to yesterday, that same organization, the WHO, declared that the outbreak had become a pandemic. Obviously, between those two dates, a lot has happened. There's been a significant response across the board in terms of travel restrictions and policy changes and adjustments to how various governments are responding to this. I think the reality is, in the past 2 weeks, from a federal standpoint, we've seen more activity on this than any other issue, and I think we can expect that to happen going forward as well. And I'll walk through a little bit of that in a few minutes. Eric, if we could go to the next slide. There we go. Obviously, the immediate focus of policymakers is on the health and safety of Americans and everybody across the world. And I think if you look at their initial response, it's very focused on health and safety. However, there's an increasing concern, obviously, about the economy. And I think anybody who's watching the markets and how they're responding globally there's been some concern. Even as late as today, it hit the 7% drop trigger to temporarily stop the market again. I believe that's the second time that that's happened. And so I think we're not financial analysts, but it's very clear that there will be a policy response to concerns around the economy, in addition to the ongoing response around the concerns for the health and safety of communities throughout the country. I'll pass it back over to Noah to talk a little bit about a very quick overview of where we stand in terms of the outbreak worldwide.
Thanks, Charles. So as we all know, this started in Wuhan in central China with a large impact quickly across Asia and now into Europe. It's getting a lot stronger too in Italy and in Iran, obviously being the highest cases after Japan and China. So again, this is on every continent besides Antarctica, and I'm imagine we'll continue to see that spread. So we'll go to the next slide really quickly. Looking at the US, again, these maps are from this morning, so make sure to stay updated with current resources of the spread, but in almost all 50 states, save for a few, and obviously with some epicenters around major metropolitan areas. Go to the next slide. The CDC is continually updating their travel advisories. So we highly recommend staying up to date if you or your employees are still continuing to travel throughout this. So Europe being the most recent region with the CDC labeling it a level 3 health notice. So please make sure to stay updated on CDC travel advisories and aware of what countries are doing internally and what restrictions they may be imposing that we should be aware of with any business or personal travel even. Next slide. And just a list of a few other countries with their own specific travel advisories. So again, separate from the CDC and what they're advising to US citizens, these are internal to these countries and can definitely impact US citizens as foreign nationals to these areas.
Thank you.
I'll send this one back.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now for sort of the focus of our presentation is to talk a little bit about what the federal response is and where the policy focus is. As I mentioned at the top of the call, the agenda over the last 2 weeks has been significantly shifted, both in terms of the policy agenda on Capitol Hill, as well as the agenda, the regulatory agenda of the administration. And I think the most immediate focus has been trying to pass legislation to increase funding across the board for the health response across the country. So on March 6th, the president signed into law legislation that passed the House and Senate that would essentially provide $8.3 billion in emergency funding to respond mostly to the healthcare needs throughout the country. That was sort of the immediate focus. I think I wouldn't necessarily say that's the last of the funding they'll do in that realm, but it's certainly a significant portion right out of the gate here, and that starts moving now towards a little bit more of a focus around what stimulus package they would do for the economy. We can go to the next slide. And as we speak right now, the House and Senate and White House are trying to negotiate some sort of a stimulus bill to help both workers as well as industries that are impacted by this. I think what we have already seen is the members of the Democratic caucus in the House has produced legislation that would try to accomplish a few things in sort of what is called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And that is free testing for coronavirus. It establishes a new paid leave policy. It helps strengthen food assistance through federal food assistance programs, addresses unemployment aid, protects healthcare workers that could be impacted by this, safeguards Medicaid benefits And I think the Senate, that's a House bill. The Senate is trying to look at a number of other issues, as is the White House, in terms of more on the corporate side, potentially something addressing a payroll tax and other issues. But this is sort of the second phase of a policy response to coronavirus. And I think what is going to happen, the Senate has just announced right before we got on this call that they were expected to leave after this week. They're actually going to stay in session and try to finish business on this sort of stimulus package, if you will. And then it's somewhat unclear what the next steps will be at this point. But I think the macro point here is that the Congress is very focused on obviously getting that $8.3 billion out the door for a health response, and now looking a little bit at from a financial response to what individual employees may face and potentially what employers may face to try to get legislation out the door around that. It's a little unclear what that final product will be. I know that those negotiations are happening right now in real time, and there is some disagreement between the House and Senate as to the direction of that. The bill I just outlined again was what the House is doing. I think after this stimulus package, assuming that gets done at some point in the near future, the agenda is not going to move far beyond the coronavirus. There's a number of other bills that we've been watching over the course of the last year that if you're a regular attendee on some of these calls, you've been made aware of, including things like the surface transportation reauthorization bill, which is all the bike funding for bike lanes and trails and all sorts of infrastructure, as well as an infrastructure package, which has been a key focus of Congress, and a big public lands package that focuses on LWCF and maintenance backlog. I think it's fair to say, while those were all really top priorities, it's not that you won't necessarily see them move this year, but obviously they're going to be pushed back a little bit, I believe, in the agenda in order to focus narrowly around the coronavirus response, and for good reason. So we may see those things pop up again on the agenda down the road, maybe if there's some opportunity sooner than that. But I do think for the foreseeable future, the priorities that we've been focused on will be appropriately usurped by anything related to responding to coronavirus and funding that response as well. I think as you've probably seen on the news, the White House obviously came out with some new policies last night in regards to travel. They did clarify that the cargo portion of the restrictions were not in place, and there's also some question as to what would happen on the China 301 tariffs if that was potentially going to be pulled back. And today in the press there was an indication that that's unlikely to happen. So I know that there's a number of people on the call that are interested in that issue specifically. It seems as though that is probably not going to be the case in the near term. So we'll obviously keep you updated on what that federal response is, but for now, keep an eye out for that stimulus package. We will definitely keep an update on our website about it, and we'll also keep an update if they come back for additional funding for the response and delineate what that is. Eric, let's go to the next slide. The press obviously is now increasingly focused on this, and I'd say similar to Congress, they're very focused on the health response, and they're increasingly focused on what the economic response is. And I think that will also drive some of what the focus is down the road on the policy side as well. But I think the House and Senate are both expected to go out of session at the end of this week. The Senate has already said they're staying in. I think there's a big question going forward as to whether the House and Senate will be coming back according to their existing schedule, or whether they'll give it a little bit more time to see what the path of the the current crisis takes and what response is needed. So we're obviously waiting on that as well. Let's go to the next slide. So with that, I know NOAA has a couple resources that we want to direct you all to in addition to the People for Bikes website. So I'll pass it back to NOAA.
Thanks, Charles. So again, we want to make sure that you guys all have the best information as soon as you need it. So we highly recommend staying in tune of what's going on with your local and state government, because they'll have the probably fastest and quickest response to the situation around wherever you're based. So make sure to sign up for whatever newsletters, alerts, things like that you can to stay aware and keep your business ready. Federally, make sure you bookmark the pages for the CDC, Center for Disease Control. White House announcements obviously are really important, especially around travel and economics, and the HHS, Health and Human Services, for other health-related updates on spread and things like that. Lastly, we really have been using and enjoying the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a great website to offer resources to employees and employers about how to manage your business in the time of coronavirus and with such a fluid situation that changes on the hour, no less the day. So we highly recommend checking out the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's website, and that's an easy Google search. We'll also include it in the follow-up from this as sort of the gold standard that is available right now for how to make the decisions that you may need to make. And again, you are your own experts on those issues, and we just want to make sure you have the resources and the background information from Washington, D.C. With that, I'll end our part of the presentation, but I definitely want to open it up for a few questions, which I think we have time for if you want to ask any now. If you have questions down the line about how we can be helpful, please reach out to us. Our emails are below, Eric and myself, noah@peopleforbikes.org, and we will respond promptly. So with that, Eric, I will let you list off any questions.
Great. Thanks, Noah. Thank you, Charles, for that. Very informative for all of our members here. And I do have a few questions here. One of them is, are there any plans in place on how key U.S. ports plan to operate should COVID-19 impact their workers?
At this point, I don't have an update on that. I think a lot of issues like that are being worked out right now. So we can follow up with a response on that with sort of more up-to-date information. Some of these issues are being updated so rapidly, it's a little difficult to report out on them without being wrong. So I want to be right on that, and we'll make sure to update you on that directly.
Great, thank you, Charles. And we have a question here about the list of resources. For everybody that registered for the webinar today, I will be sending out a quick follow-up email with those listed out. So if you didn't catch them just now, they will be in your inbox shortly. One more here. The virus goes through build-up, peak, wind-down cycle. If we have an event in the next few months, should we already cancel or postpone? What about the event? An event the day after tomorrow? From all the guidance that we've heard, large events over 100 people should be postponed in specific areas. Even I'm not sure how large your event is or where you're located, but if you would like to talk offline about that, we can certainly show you the right resources towards making that decision that'll be best for you and your participants.
And Eric, I may just add to that, as you're seeing on the news, the quick adjustments around what is happening in events, especially in a lot of these major markets, is changing very rapidly. So the most important resource you have on that is your local government, and I would make sure to keep in very close contact with them and what they advise you to do. And I think that's probably the most important resource you have, as well as whatever federal guidance that there is on events. But local governments, mayors, offices generally are providing a lot of really good feedback and advice, and in some cases mandates as to what should happen. And so make sure to check those resources first before making any decision.
Great, thank you, Charles. And that looks like the end of our questions for right now, but please do shoot your questions over to Noah and myself. We would be happy to answer those as best we can and point you towards the right resources. Actually, we have one here. Charles, could you repeat your comment about tariffs for us?
Sure. There was some question as to whether there may be within the sort of broader policy response on the economic side, whether tariffs may be reduced or removed temporarily on the 301 tariffs that are in place on a lot of our products. I think generally speaking, there's been some interest in doing that by a number of industries. And today in the press, the administration indicated that that was unlikely to happen. So, if that changes, obviously we'll keep everybody updated, but certainly on the near-term horizon, we don't see any adjustment in those tariffs happening, or we have not been given any reason to believe that there would be an adjustment outside of the normal exemption process and everything else.
Thank you, Charles. And with that, we will conclude things today. Again, thank you to all of our members and our attendees today. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to get up to date with the latest information that we can share with you. Thanks.